Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're talking about what now? President Obama just gave a major address yesterday. Today, he meets with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the White House. Our guests are Jeremy Ben-Ami, president of J Street, Noura Erakat, Palestinian human rights attorney, and Norman Finkelstein, author who's written a number of books on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Norman Finkelstein, on this issue of land swaps, is it feasible to have land swaps for the goal of a contiguous state?
Of course it's feasible to have land swaps. But the question is whether the borders are subject to mutual agreement. Now, Jeremy says that he represents the moderate center versus the extremes, and I'm one of the extremes. But my position is the position of the International Court of Justice. The court ruled in July 2004 that the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, and the whole of East Jerusalem are occupied Palestinian territories, which are the designated unit for Palestinian self-determination. Just as Israel's borders are not subject to mutual agreement, neither should the borders of the Palestinian state be subject to Israeli acquiescence. If, when they sit down in negotiations, Israel presents a reasonable offer and it says we want to keep, say, 1.9% of the settlement, 1.9% of the West Bank, and we'll give you land of equal value and equal size in Israel, well, the Palestinians are free to say yes or no. But if the Palestinians choose to say no because they don't want the settlement of Ma'ale Adunim going all the way from Jerusalem to Jericho and bisecting their country, or they don't want the settlement of Ariel going all the way across and bisecting the northern half of the West Bank, they have to be free to say no. Otherwise, there's not going to be a settlement. And that's exactly what's not allowed for. At least Jeremy said equal size. He didn't say equal value, but let's say equal size. Obama was very careful not to say that. He just said mutually agreed land swaps. That can be a ratio of 5 to 1. It can be a ratio of 7 to 1. That's not a basis for a settlement. That's a basis for Israeli veto over the size and shape of a Palestinian state. And that's unacceptable. But I have to emphasize, that's not the extreme position. Every year, 165 countries in the United Nations reiterate what I say, or to put it more accurately, I'm reiterating what they say. Jeremy's position is the position of the United States, Israel, Nauru, Palau, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Australia. Those are the dissenters. I'm very smack in the middle on this debate.
Jeremy Ben-Ami of J Street.
Well, actually, the position that I'm outlining is the position of the quartet, which represents the UN, the EU, Russia, and the United States, which is that the agreement needs to be one that is negotiated and accepted by both parties. The basis of conflict and war is when two sides stand on their high ground and say, well, we have rights to this and you don't, and then they fight it out. The only hope for an end to this conflict and the reason for diplomacy is to explore the art of the possible. And how do we get both sides to relinquish what they both view as their right? And I think this is the only way that we're going to avoid a third intifada, the only way that we're going to avoid an explosion in the region is if we will agree that there's going to have to be a mutual agreement, because that's how we will get both sides to recognize each other and put this conflict to rest forever.
Jeremy, are Israel's borders subject to a Palestinian agreement? Are Israel's borders subject to Palestinian agreement? Or was a precondition for negotiations that the Palestinians had to accept Israel in its pre-67 borders? Which was it? Is it subject to negotiations?
Well, at the moment, the unfortunate truth for the State of Israel and for those of us who support the State of Israel is that Israel doesn't have internationally recognized borders.
No, it certainly does. The World Court says it does. The International Court of Justice says it does. The United Nations General Assembly says it does. No, the world does.
The world generally does not accept those borders.
That's not true, Jeremy. Jeremy, that's simply not true.
You can shout.
Well, let me bring Noura into the conversation. Specifically, I wanted to ask you about because President Obama was very clear that whatever happens at the United Nations this fall is going to have, from his perspective, no bearing on how things are negotiated between the Palestinians and Israel. Your sense of the upcoming United Nations vote on recognizing a Palestinian state?
Sure. I just want to comment also on this discussion that's happening about borders and not borders. What Israel has been doing is trying to create its own de facto borders and therefore not recognizing that there is an armistice line. There is a green line, and that's exactly what Norman is referring to, that the ICJ has referred to as well. What we are debating is whether or not this state will be viable as outlined by Obama, but I think that that is a false premise. It's not about whether or not the states will be a viable state for Palestinians. Palestinians are looking and seeking and demanding and are entitled to self-determination, equality, freedom, dignity, and their call is the same as their Arab brethren in the region. That's why the statehood strategy is also not going to be sufficient, because even if a state was declared, even if it was recognized by a two-thirds majority that's able to overturn a Security Council veto or to challenge it, that won't suffice to offer sovereignty and dignity and liberty for Palestinians.
Noura, I want to get you to respond to President Obama speaking yesterday, where he rejected Palestinian efforts to have the United Nations recognize Palestine as an independent state.
For the Palestinians, efforts to delegitimize Israel will end in failure. Symbolic actions to isolate Israel at the United Nations in September won't create an independent state. Palestinian leaders will not achieve peace or prosperity if Hamas insists on a path of terror and rejection. And Palestinians will never realize their independence by denying the right of Israel to exist.
President Obama yesterday, Noura Erakat.
It's quite unfortunate, again, the reference to Palestinians pursuing a path that's not tenable. This is precisely the path that we should be on, that the U.S. has siphoned this discussion and isolated it so that it created a tension between human rights, international law, and politics is precisely what has undermined the Palestinian platform to achieve any semblance of self-determination. And I think that by returning to this multilateral platform where might doesn't equal right, but there is a point of departure, and that point of departure is international law, is a positive step.
In the Move Over AIPAC meeting that's taking place this weekend, explain it.
Move Over AIPAC is really a precedent-setting meeting in that it's going to challenge the Israel lobby, which was wonderfully articulated by Stephen Walt and John Mersheimer in their book, in their manuscript. And what it will do is to bring constituents to Washington to be able to demonstrate their constituent support for a different policy on the Middle East, on Israel and Palestine, to their lawmakers, who, by the way, behind closed doors, lament that there aren't more voices that can support them in taking a more critical stance.
And Jeremy Ben-Ami, how does J Street relate to AIPAC?
Well, there's a lot that we have in common. There's a lot that we disagree with them on. You know, we are supporters of the relationship, the special relationship between Israel and the United States. We do support Israel's right to self-defense, and we support efforts by the United States to support Israel in that regard. However, at the same time, we don't support an Israel right or wrong foreign policy for the United States. There's an American national interest in bringing about an end to this conflict. A reasonable two-state solution is articulated by the president. And I think while there are some who are worried about the reception for the president at AIPAC and whether or not he'll find support in that organization, he should know that the majority of Jewish Americans, the majority of the organizations in the American Jewish community, Anti-Defamation League, American Jewish Committee, and others do support his two-state vision that he outlined yesterday and came out with statements of support. So we are differing with AIPAC on a number of its particulars. We're supportive of the general mission of a strong and robust relationship between the United States and Israel. And, of course, we're big proponents of a two-state solution and the right of the Palestinian people to freedom and self-determination, as Noura Erakat is saying, within a two-state solution.
And Norm, I'd like to ask you, Jeremy mentioned before the involvement of the quartet, but there have been increasing fissures within that group as well. Israel attempted to is withholding the tax revenues of the Palestinian Authority after the reconciliation with Hamas, and immediately the European Union has announced that it is increasing its aid to the Palestinian Authority because they see this reconciliation as a positive move forward.
The quartet is an ad hoc body consisting of the Russian Federation, the United States, the European Union, and Tony Blair. I can't recall right now the fourth. There are
the UN.
There are no, not the United Nations. The UN every year has a resolution called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. It's every year in the United Nations in November of each year. And every year they outline the principles for resolving the conflict. We don't need Mr. Obama to conjure up new principles any more than we needed President Bush to conjure them up. We have the platform or the basic principles based on international law. And those principles have been ratified every year, not only by the UN General Assembly. They're ratified every year by all 22 members of the Arab League. They were ratified by the 57 members of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. And I regret to say that contrary to what Jeremy is saying, those principles are explicit. Recognition of Israel in its June 67 border. Incidentally, the Islamic Republic of Iran every year votes with a majority in the UN. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a member of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. They ratified the two-state settlement on the June 67 border. There is no dispute about this. There is no denial of Israel's right to its June 67 border. The only question is the right of the Palestinians to their border of the whole of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. That's the only issue that's open because of Israel and the United States.